Claire, are you okay? Claire, I'm going to start the webinar now.
Okay, so that's 10 o'clock now, and I think we should get started. So Claire, if you could put up the slides, please. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the slides. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, Government Decision Making in Uncertainty. So my name is Keith Gourley of the Government Actuaries Department, and I'm your chair this morning. So just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. Claire, could you just flick through the slide, please? And as you know, this session is part of the Analysis in Government Month. So for further information on events during this month, please refer to gov.uk and search for Government Analysis Function, or YouTube/Government Analysis Function, or Twitter gov_analysis. Next slide, please, Claire. Thank you. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? The theme is government decision making in uncertainty, and there's going to be 2 case studies. Sorry, Claire, I don't know if you can flick the slide, please. Okay, case study number 1. Yep, that's great. So the theme is government decision making in uncertainty, and we're going to hear 2 case studies this morning. Case study number 1 is about how analysis has supported the development of the UK space industry, and that case study is going to be presented by Nick Clitheroe of the Government Actuaries Department, and also by Steve Plant of the UK Space Agency. Case study number 2 is about the NERC digital platform, and that is all about facilitating access to climate and health data, and that's going to be presented by Professor Richard Kingston of the University of Manchester. We are going to 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, so please submit questions as we go through. For those of you who are in Slido, the event code is 684263. So I think without further ado, I'm now going to pass over to Nick Clitheroe. Nick.
Thanks, Keith. Okay, so I'm Nick Clitheroe from Government Actuaries Department. And when I first started at GAD, I did not expect to be working on space. If we can move on to the first of my slides, please. You may have seen in the papers information about the possibility of launch from the UK. And I've seen these headlines, being very interested in space myself, but didn't expect to work on it. However, following a unexpected phone call, I got speaking to Steve Plant from United Kingdom Space Agency. And Steve is going to give us an introduction to what this project is about, and then I'll talk a bit more about the analysis that we performed. Over to Steve.
Thanks, Nick, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be able to speak to you today about what we're doing at UKSA with regards to our launch programme. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So just a little bit about the UK Space Agency, first of all. We've just updated our mission statement, so this is very new. Our mission statement is to inspire and lead the UK in space to benefit our planet and its people. And so the role of the Space Agency is to provide technical advice to government on its developing strategy, and then to deliver programmes to actually implement that strategy as well, and to promote the sector more generally. So Claire, can I have the next slide, please? So there's a huge amount of really exciting stuff that's happening with the UK Space Agency and the UK space sector generally, getting involved in scientific missions. So, for example, the Perseverance Mars rover that you would no doubt have seen that landed recently on Mars, James Webb Space Telescope, programs to help disaster recovery efforts in countries that suffer disasters, and also, as we had there, say, the Launch UK programme, as Nick had mentioned as well, so to enable launch capability from the UK. The UK is a global leader in satellite construction and also and particularly telecommunication satellites. But the thing that we don't do at the moment is actually launch those satellites from here in the UK. They're currently launched from overseas. And historically, with satellites being very large, the UK hasn't been an optimal place to launch from. However, as the satellite technology develops and satellites are getting smaller and smaller, the UK actually is becoming a prime location for launching satellites into the types of orbits that are desired for lots of different types of purposes. And so over the course of the next decade, for example, we think there's a £4 billion launch market available to the UK, and we want to be the first commercial site in Europe to actually launch rockets from into orbit. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So we've set up the spaceflight programme. This is a cross-departmental effort. So we working collaboratively with the Department for Transport, BAYS, the Civil Aviation Authority, as well as ourselves, to develop a programme and legislation to enable launch capability from the UK. And so we want to be the first country in Europe to be able to offer this facility, and so we're hoping that launches will take place from next year. So we've got secondary legislation about to enter Parliament, so we'll be hoping to be able to accept applications for launch licenses in the very near future. So can I have the next slide, please? So as we can see here, there are a number of areas where spaceports are being considered. And those spaceports can also look to cater for different types of launch activity. So we've got the traditional sort of vertical rockets that you would have seen launching from elsewhere. These are smaller rockets than the Falcon and the SpaceX type of rockets and the Ariane 5 from the European Space Agency. But we're also looking at being able to cater for other types of launch vehicle as well. And so we'll go into that in the next slide, please, Claire. So we're looking at, say, new developments in new technologies. So, for example, air launch rockets. So rockets that are launched from underneath 747, converted 747s, for example. Also from rockets that are launched from underneath balloons, and also what we call suborbital flights as well. So flights that will involve paying participants and that will go to the edge of space. So, for example, the Virgin Galactic type of operation that you may well have seen as well. And we're looking to build spaceports to cater for those for that type of launch activity, and also provide the supporting infrastructure as well. So providing range control to be able to track the rockets, etc., as they are launched. So it's a very wide-ranging program of support for to launch the commercial space sector within the UK for launch. Can I have the next slide, please, Karen? So it's great, obviously, that we're developing this launch program, but with it, there comes a lot of responsibility from the UK regulatory perspective. Spaceflight is a risky operation. And so therefore safety is absolutely paramount in terms of anything that we look to license from here in the UK. So there are international obligations that we have to follow. There is one of the suite of documents associated with the UN space treaties, which deals specifically with liabilities. It's called the Liability Convention. And under the Liability Convention, it's ultimately the UK government that is responsible for its space objects and activities, and also the activities of UK nationals as well. And so the provisions within the Liability Convention enable foreign nationals, if they suffer damage, to launch a claim against the UK government for any, to claim compensation. And now, if that damage arises on the earth or in the air, then it's what we call an absolute or a strict liability. So it means that no fault needs to be established in order to make the claim. In space, it's slightly different. It is a fault-based regime. And what we've done here in the UK is we've introduced those international obligations through legislation. So we introduced the Space Industry Act in 2018. There is the Outer Space Act 1986, which also covers the launches from abroad and the satellite operations that we currently license as part of the UK. So there is an international context in which we work with regards to liabilities and also insurance as well. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So liabilities provisions. I've put some examples here about near misses that have happened. And many of you may very well have seen the unfurling incident over the weekend, where there was concern that a stage from a Chinese rocket launching the first part of the Chinese space station could have landed and caused damage on Earth as it re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. So this is one of the reasons, demonstrations to why there are liability provisions set at the international level. And so in developing our launch capability, one of the key things from our perspective is also thinking about how we would set our liabilities and the level at which we would set them with regards to the insurance as well. Claire, can I have the next slide, please? So in terms of the challenges, obviously we talked about their launch capability. Launch will be taking place from different types of sites, different types of launch operations will produce different types of risks. So there's an inherent uncertainty about what exactly will happen in the event of a spaceflight incident. There is huge amounts of modelling that is undertaken, or that will be undertaken with regards to license applications, but there is still a residual uncertainty. And if something does happen, we don't know exactly who will be impacted by it, what will be impacted by it. And therefore, in terms of calculating insurance requirements, that was a key policy challenge for us. So our question of GAD was to ask, would it be possible to derive a single figure that we could use to calculate insurance requirements for each of the following types of loss: death, injury, and property damage? Because we wanted ultimately to keep our solution as simple as possible, but to provide as much assurance as we could do, that we tried to cover off as much risk as possible. And that's where Nick and the expertise at GAD came in really useful to be able to inform the policy as we move forward on this. So Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. So we're looking at what was called the model insurance requirement, and it actually started with a phone call where, as Steve outlined, I was pretty much asked, how much will it cost if someone is killed or injured? Well, that's actually not a simple question, as we go on to see. Next slide, please. So since 1957, there have been 6,065 attempts for launch, of which 91% have been fully successful, 6.8% have failed, but only one has ever led to a third-party claim. Now, when you're looking at work like this and trying to work out how much things are typically going to cost, the normal starting place would be past history. So if you want to know how much it's going to cost if a space rocket crashes, you look at past history. There isn't any. So this is where analysis came in, and we needed to look at other options. And we came up with a collaborative approach between GAD and UK Space Agency. So the average payment on death, the average payment on injury, the average cost for damage, and business interruption costs were what we were looking to calculate. And that would be put together with the detailed modelling that the UK Space Agency engineers were doing to model potential incidents that might happen. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So the first thing that we decided to do was to look at how much may be paid in the instance of a fatal accident. And starting point for the research, what's out there in the news, what headlines are there? Now, the examples that I've put on the slide, you will notice have some very large figures, or the alternative is they have no figures at all. And one of the main reasons for this is that compensation for fatal accidents is often settled out of court. There's no national database, so we had to see what further information was available. Next slide, please. So, according to the Fatal Accidents Act, there is set rules as to what can be claimed in the case of death. There's compensation for pain between the accident and death, actual costs of care which are provided, loss of earnings, funeral expenses, bereavement loss for family members, loss of dependency, and associated legal fees. If we move on to the next slide, please. So within the UK, there's quite a clear structure for the way damages are paid. You can get general damages, which covers the pain and suffering, and there's a published judicial guideline. But in effect, the bereavement award, which is the basic amount that is likely to be paid, is only just under £13,000. Because there are other allowances that can be paid, we decided a figure of £50,000 for that was appropriate. The other side is special damages, and this is to compensate for additional losses. So, for example, loss of earnings, loss of pension, loss of services for the dependents. So, what we did is we researched what data was available to help us with this, and then we built a detailed model that looked at every single age, looked at the age distribution, and then the demography across the country to decide what was the appropriate figure to use overall. If we move on to the next slide. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about the source of our information. And an awful lot of our information came from Office for National Statistics data, which is widely available on the internet. So for dependency, obviously, a different amount is going to be paid on whether there's a dependent or not. So 47% of people have no dependents, 31% have a spouse only, 19% spouse and a child, and 3% with child only. And this can make quite a big difference to what a court is likely to award. We also did quite a lot of research on court cases. And a favourite of mine being Harris v Emperor Motors in 1984, where a precedent was set that in the case of people having no dependent children, 33% of your income is considered to be spent on yourself. The remainder is available for both yourself and partner. In the case where people do have dependent children, they only spend 25% of their income on themselves. 75% is available to the wider family. Now, I'm not going to go through the calculation in red on the table, but this actually gives us a specific calculation so we can say how much a person would be likely to get on the instance of suffering a bereavement based on their income and the income of the person who died. Next slide, please. Okay, so we needed to make some key assumptions. And again, most of these came from ONS data. We needed an average salary figure. That came from ONS data. we decided to assume that deceased and spouse salaries were equal. And this is because we need to work out an average figure overall. We assumed deceased and spouses were the same age. Again, fine, as we're working out an average figure, and it could go either way. And we needed to know the age of children. And I was actually surprised at how much detail there was in terms of statistics on things like the average age of a father at the birth of the last born child. Using that sort of information, we were able to calculate likely ages, age distributions of children to help come up with a likely payment on bereavement. We've used pension age of 67. That was agreed with UKSA. And for pension purposes, 2/3 of salary or the average pension figure, again from ONS data, if the pension wasn't in payment. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this slide actually shows the results. So on the right-hand side, we have, for different age groups, the likely female with spouse and child average death benefit that a court would be likely to award. And you can see there is a massive difference in the amount depending on the actual age. And there would be also changes depending on whether or not there was a spouse and sex. So this needs to be converted into a single figure. It's also worth saying these are average figures. In actual fact, payments of multiple millions could easily be paid, like was the case we saw in some of the newspaper examples. So we then used the structure of the United Kingdom in terms of dependencies, with children, without children, to work out what the average would be across the whole population. The overall average only came to £244,000, which was quite a surprise as to how low it was. Next slide, please. I seem to have lost the slides. We've lost the slides, Keith.
Yeah, we've lost the slides. Claire. Hi, Claire. Hoping you're managing to get them back up. Claire, hi there. I don't know if you can hear me. Hi.
Sorry, my internet disconnected. Just getting them back up now.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that.
I will carry on talking, Keith, because
Okay.
I think we can do. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Claire.
Okay, so in the case of injury, we again had to look and see what information was available. Now, I'm sure you've all had phone calls about the accident that you were involved in and how people can get you compensation. And however annoying they are, the internet version is very useful as a source of information as to what you are likely to get paid for various types of injury. And we made use of a lot of those sort of internet searches, and also there are some published guidelines. And I've given some examples here. At the time this work was done, the maximum that you were likely to get for injury was 354,000. But there's a whole range of things. So injury to a lower leg, up to 10,500. Neck injuries between 6,900 and 22,000. But when you compare that to the 354,000, there's quite a big difference. But again, this is general damages specific to the injury itself. There's also the other side of special damages. If we move on to the next slide, please. So special damages is the compensation when you're not able to work, for example, or care that is required. So again, we built a detailed model, and again, ONS data was a big help. The average salary figure was obtained from ONS data. We used an assumed contribution rate for pensions. In terms of care that was needed, we assumed 1 year for a semi-serious injury or lifetime care for a serious injury. But how do you convert that to costs? Again, ONS data enabled us to look at the typical nurse's salaries, and research showed typically it would be 2 nurses required for an average care situation. So that gave £65,000 a year. We then used the Ogden tables, which are a set of tables produced by the Government Actuaries Department to help convert an annual cost of ongoing care, for example, into a total lump sum figure. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so for injury, we suggested using 4 different categories rather than a single one. Minor injuries, for example, whiplash, you were only likely to get 5,000. For intermediate injuries, such as minor disc damage, 30,000. A semi-serious injury, meaning you may not be able to work for a year and may need some time in care, was likely to give just under 200,000. But the lifetime care scenario, for example, tetraplegia, was likely to give figures over 5 million simply because of the very large special damages figures. There was a lot of discussion as to whether we would use a single figure or the categories. We felt it was difficult to come up with a single figure because identifying the relative proportion of the types of injury was going to be very difficult. If we move on to the next slide, please. So I'll very quickly talk about property. So for property, we used 2 different sources of information. We used ONS data to look at the price per square meter by different regions for houses, and also a juice and rebuild calculator where you can put in details of a house, and our research showed that a 3-bed detached house was the average house, if there is such a thing. And it was very encouraging to find that using the 2 approaches gave us a cost in terms of square meters within £14 of each other. So that was a good basis for a property calculation. If we move on to the next slide, please. You also need to allow for contents. Again, internet searches, ABI say the average figure is 35,000. We converted that to a square meter figure. In terms of rent, which may need to be paid while someone can't live in their house, there's a home let rental index, which gives you a monthly figure. It gives you an average period. And so again, using the average house size, we can convert that to a per square meter figure. So overall, for domestic property, we came up with a figure of £1,738 per square meter. The work of the UKSA engineers worked out the likely damage area. This could be used as a figure for domestic property. And finally, if we have a quick look at commercial property on the next slide, please. So in terms of commercial property, we look at the cost of buildings. To do this, we researched figures on average rateable value, the prime yields which can be obtained, again, to come up with a square meter figure. You also need to allow for rebuild and demolition, so that's effectively half the cost of the value of a property. For contents, again, the ONS business survey was very valuable to us. So we could get figures on the average stock and work in progress, the average floor space of businesses to convert stock into an average figure per square meter. And similarly, using rateable value, we could get a figure for rent. Information from the ABI helped in terms of the cost of business interruption, and a very useful monthly magazine on Farmers Weekly and agricultural analysis provided the information I needed to convert agricultural land into a cost per square meter. So all the work we had done in terms of property and land was to get a per square meter figure, which could then be applied to the work done looking at the total damage by UK Space Agency. Now, in the interest of time, we're not going to talk now about the next steps and what we did, but we would be happy to answer any further questions on that as part of the questions. So back to Keith.
Okay, thanks very much, Nick and Steve. Very interesting. And I see we've got a few questions come in already. So please feel free to send in questions. But I'm just going to pass over to Professor Richard Kingston now, who's going to talk about the digital platform, which, as I mentioned earlier, is all about facilitating access to climate and health data. So, Richard, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about this new project that we're starting this July. So the Natural Environment Research Council are funding this project. It's for 4.25 years. The Natural Environment Research Council have a £330 million annual budget, and this project that we're just beginning is £8 million over 4 years. And basically, we're developing what's called a digital solutions hub. So NERC spend a lot of their annual budget on research projects and funding data centres across the UK that generate and then host a whole range of data about the natural environment, not just in the UK, but across the world as well, a lot of climate change data. What they've realised over the last few years is that a lot of this data, while they spend millions of pounds on it, is only really used by environmental scientists, mainly in universities. And they recognise that there's huge potential in this data for it to be used by government, by the third sector, the private sector, national, regional, right down to local levels of government as well. So what we're going to be doing over the next 4 years is developing a digital solutions hub. And the reason we won this piece of work over our sort of competitors was that we started off by saying we were going to put users at the centre of how we develop this hub. So that is people like yourselves. So we're going to be working with a whole range of different government departments and agencies, and allowing you to connect your data with a whole range of data that NERC holds as well. We're employing lots of software engineers that will work and develop and build this system. And that is equally already, we've got, as you can see there, listed sort of DEFRA, Environment Agency, NHS Digital, Health and Safety Executive, and equivalents in kind of Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, working closely with partners in those organisations, and maybe some of you on this call today might be interested in getting involved, and connecting you with our research staff and our software engineers to help us build this hub. Now, NERC's data is very broad, covers a lot of environmental areas, and we're focusing initially in building this hub around two of our strengths at Manchester. One is around analysis of climate change and looking at how we can adapt the UK to deal better with climate change, particularly around the built environment. And the other area that we're going to focus on is the connection between health, so public health, and the environment. Now, just to give you an indication of how long we've been sort of just go back a slide, sorry. An indication of how long we've, if you just go back one slide, Claire, if that's okay. Sorry, thank you. Yeah, so here we've got Connected Health Nation. That's building on some apps we've already developed at Manchester. We came up with this proposal, actually, believe it or not, before COVID. So this is not, the health connection in what we're building is not a response to COVID, although that will be quite relevant. But what we were really initially going to be focusing on is that relationship between human health and the natural environment. So we know a lot about that kind of spatial relationship between poor human health and, say, for example, living near motorways or busy roads and air pollution and things. And if you move on to the next slide, please, Claire. So what we're going to build on first, though, is some work we've done a lot around the spatial analysis of climate change. So we're going to be building on a lot of what's called geographic information systems. I guess some of you on this call know, and some of you are based in ONS, and I think the video at the start of this webinar mentioned geographers are often employed by the government. Some of you may be fully aware of what a geographic information system is. But essentially, it's kind of a very sophisticated version of sort of Google Maps, where you can map a whole range of spatial data. And what we know from when we map a lot of data, and Tobler's first law of geography is that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. And we can see that in this map here. I mean, this is just showing the susceptibility of people to flooding. So this is what we call the Neighbourhood Flood Vulnerability Index. So this isn't a map of where the most flooding necessarily occurs. What this is a map of where the sort of darker pink, orange colours on this map are where there's households that are affected by a flood are impacted greater than those areas in the purple parts of the map. Mainly because it's also relates to people's income and their ability to either adapt their home or respond after a flood has happened. So if you live in a more deprived neighbourhood, the chances are that you're less likely to have insurance coverage on your property or your land for any kind of flood risk. So it's not just a case of overlaying on the map the Environment Agency's flood risk maps, it's also accounting for the socioeconomic background of the people in different parts of the country. So by mapping a lot of this data and overlaying different kind of data sets, a lot of this, again, similar to the previous talk that comes from Office for National Statistics, it allows us to focus on particular areas where risk might be greater. And we have in this system, if you move on to the next slide, please. Within this climate just system, we've got over 300 different map layers, and you can overlay different layers of data to start to build up a picture. This is an interactive map. It's freely available. You can zoom in on the map and zoom into particular neighbourhood areas. So these areas are what we call middle and lower super output areas that allow you to look at their different impact. So one of the other data sets on here is something called inability to prepare. So this is where a local community might not have the facilities and the ability to prepare and deal with a flood. Other data sets around inability to respond, inability to recover, and a lack of community support. So again, the areas that are sort of heading more to the orange and the red colours, if you zoom in the map, this is where they have a greater impact that flood risk will affect them. So it's a bit like you've probably come across the index of multiple deprivation. We sort of build up a composite index based on relevant data sets, and we can map that across the UK and understand how that local community might need to respond. So basically the key thing here is that you don't apply one risk model to the whole of the country. By understanding the geography of risk, it helps you better focus resources and target resources where they are most needed. If we move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of where we're at the moment, so we've developed a number of tools around climate change mapping. We've developed some tools and apps around things like relationship between the environment and respiratory illness. What we're going to be doing starting from this July is building this digital solutions hub, building on some of those use cases, those two examples of health and climate change, and taking all of, so that the boxes there in the green are the different Natural Environment Research Council's environmental data centres that are spread around the UK, based in different universities, where we're harnessing all of that data and bringing that together in one single place. We're not replicating, we're not copying that data. This hub will connect seamlessly to that data, and we're also integrating that with a lot of the government's data APIs. So if you're not aware of what an API is, that's an application programming interface. That means that you can seamlessly connect into that data, whether it be DEFRA, Homes, Communities and Local Government, Environment Agency, ONS, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and you'll be able to kind of do a pick and mix of the data that is relevant to what it is that you're trying to address. We then have all of our University of Manchester compute services to run a lot of the computational analysis on that data, and also something on there that the photograph, you can't really tell what that is very much, but that is Jasmine, the photograph in the bottom left-hand corner. That is NERC's supercomputer based in Oxfordshire. And for the first time, sort of non-academics are going to be able to leverage the power of that supercomputer to run analysis and models on all of this data, a mixture of NERC data, government data, data that you might hold yourselves within your own organisation, and run that through this hub. and do analysis and run models in ways that have not been possible before. There's also going to be access for this as well as the commercial sector, third sector, public sector, academics, that other organisations and users can upload their own data through citizen science and things, and add their own primary data onto this system as well. So the idea is that this will connect a lot of disparate data sets. And normally what tends to happen with all of these things, particularly in universities, you get funded to a piece of research, you develop something that might be quite useful, and then you go out there to the wider world and say, hey, look, we've built this, would this be useful for you? We're turning that approach completely on its head, and we're starting off with you as potential users. So we're going out there, and we're going to be starting later this year in the autumn, running a series of workshops around the country, or maybe through things like this still, depending on where we are with COVID. To basically put you as potential users at the heart of this and say, right, what are the kind of problems and the problems that you face on a day-to-day and medium to longer term basis, where NERC's data might help you better understand the kind of decision-making problems you're dealing with, and getting you then to help us develop a whole new set of tools and co-create those to meet your particular needs. And over the next 4 years or so, 4 and a bit years, we will build and develop this digital solutions hub in collaboration with our partners, which could be yourselves, so that when we get to the end of this, we've actually built a system, this hub, that will be fit for purpose, fit for your particular purpose, rather than sort of doing it the usual way, when we say, right, we've built this thing, go and use it, and then you sort of tell us, well, actually, it's not doing what we really wanted to do. And we've learned over the years that it's much better to get potential users involved at the very start, so that we build something that is exactly fit for purpose. And at the heart of this, obviously, because the vast majority of NERC's data is spatial data, it can be presented on a map. So a lot of this will involve some kind of mapping interface, so you can zoom into different parts of the country. There are ambitions of this to work internationally as well. Not all of NERC's data is UK based. And we are talking with other international organisations about how we can potentially scale this up to a global level as well. And the key thing is this is not just a directory of all this kind of data. The data will sit where, that's why we're using these APIs and connecting remotely to the data. We're not holding all of this data in Manchester. What we are doing is building the functionality, the interface, and the ability to run the data on the supercomputer. So it will develop tools and kind of widgets and gadgets on top of this data sort of infrastructure. That means that you can log into this and run your particular models to fit and respond to what it is that you might be dealing with. And the final slide then, please. Claire. So I suppose just to summarize, I mean, what we'll say is a lot of what we're doing is to say that geography matters, that the kind of spatial data analysis that we're building in these tools allows you to target responses and resources to the places where they're most needed. The digital solutions hubs workshops will begin in the autumn, so you can contact me on that email address, and there's further details on the website there. If you've not been aware of what we've done most recently on the Climate Just website, so if you want to delve more deeply into those maps that I showed earlier, as I said, there's over 300 layers of data in there. You can find that on the Climate Just website. That was developed a few years ago with funding from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where as part of this project, we're going to be updating that. It does rely on a lot of census data. So once the 21 census is published in the next few years, we'll be updating that and adding more data to that. But really, this was sort of partly showing you what we've done in the past and a bit of a kind of sales pitch to say, if you think that this is going to be something useful, please do get in touch. And we're starting this project on the 1st of July. It's a 4.25-year project, and we'd be very welcome for you to be involved in those workshops. So I will finish there, and I guess then we're over to dealing with questions.
Hi, Richard. Yeah, thanks very much for that. And thanks very much to the audience for sending in so many questions. Nick has been furiously typing away. So I know that you want to pick up some of these questions, Nick, that have come through the Q&A. So I'll just hand over to you and Steve now.
I'm actually going to ask Steve to take the first one because there's been quite a few questions on the international aspect of claims, which Steve's going to talk about.
First question we've got is from Michael about who's responsible for issuing authorization. So the licensing activity under the Space Industry Act will be undertaken by the Civil Aviation Authority. So they'll be assuming the regulatory functions for issuing licenses, and the rationale for that is exactly is reflected in there. Really, is to keep the regulatory function separate from the sort of government control, the government promotion of the sector function. So CA has obviously looks at Civil Aviation Authority looks at aviation issues, as regulator for aviation, has a long history of dealing with such issues, and so there are parallels and overlaps between space flight and aviation. So CAA as an independent regulator will issue licenses on that. So we've got a couple of questions on the international context. So one from June, Brian, and yeah, so obviously we really sincerely hope that nothing happens. The way that the modelling is done, we'll check to see whether there's any overflight of populated areas. So you're really looking to minimise the risks to populations. So hence the locations of the spaceports and for physical infrastructure, or for where an air launch will take place from, takes that into account to really minimise the risks of overflight of populated areas or areas that could be damaged in the event of an incident. Now, if something were unfortunately to happen, obviously UK would be involved in accident investigation issues and things like that. And if damage were to arise, then the government of any party affected by the incident would then be able to launch a claim through their governments against the UK in terms of a compensation claim. So, we're really looking to minimise the impact in an international context, but also in terms of the trajectory of the rockets that are taken. But if there is an incident, then there are international rules around how the compensation is treated. So hopefully that answers the question on that one.
There's a question about where this work lies in terms of the HMT balance sheet review and the new CLCC which has been set up. This piece of work has actually been done very closely with Treasury. Steve and myself have had a lot of meetings with people in Treasury talking exactly about this, about the contingent liabilities, what are acceptable costs to government, to what extent do the UK Space Agency need to make charges to cover for the potential costs. And we've actually given presentations on this, and it's actually being looked at as potentially part of a framework of how an ideal calculation can work. The new organisation looking at contingent liabilities has a lot of involvement from GAD, and the sort of calculations that have been performed here are exactly the sort of things that are likely to take place in contingent liability work. So hopefully it will be possible to replicate this on other projects. There was a question from June about the property value figures incentivize building, presumably the launches from more remote places. I think what I would say is that the location of the probable launches came before the piece of work that we actually did. However, recognizing that the costs were likely to be different in different areas is the reason why we put forward to UKSA different values for different areas. I think those sort of things may well have been factored in, and certainly how populated an area is will have an effect, I assume, on where it's chosen to launch from, but that was actually done before we started looking at these costs.
Yeah, just on that point, Nick, I mean, on one of the previous slides, you would have seen that actually the location of spaceports is in coastal areas. And so obviously to minimise the potential downrange risks, as we would call them, so that you're not overflying populated areas, for instance. So these areas will be remoter areas away from populated areas. So the air-launched rockets, for instance, so what we call horizontal launch operations, will take place from already existing aerodromes. So there are a number of airports, for example, Newquay, Glasgow Prestwick as well, that have expressed an interest in becoming spaceports, and an aircraft will take off from those areas. Obviously, the launch will then take place from over the sea, away from populated areas. So, so as Nick said, the choice of location is more related to risk rather than property values. But again, we may reflect on the methodology in future about how this regionalisation may affect the amount of insurance requirement at a later stage, following a review once we've had the first launches.
Steve, there's a question on the Slido about point estimate or range estimate, and I think that's effectively to both of us. I know you've said that you would like to pick up the one that's come through Zoom. And I would just say, in terms of the Slido question, in terms of the information we provided, we did give a range of information. We didn't just provide point estimates, and we showed how the figures could be nothing, but in terms of death could also be multi-millions. And we had detailed conversations with the engineers doing the modeling work, and it was agreed we needed to use an average figure overall because we were looking to make the calculation at a set level of probability. So from our point of view, yes, we provided that information, but an average was used. One other thing I would just pick up on, actually, I'll hand over to Steve to talk about the uncertainty from a UKSA point of view.
Yes, I mean, perhaps I don't know. Perhaps now might be a good opportunity on that point to think about how we actually applied the work that GAD did for us in terms of the methodology. So, as was noted within Nick's presentation, for certain categories there was a range of different figures given, depending on, for example, for death, level of dependence, and the national average. And again, we had the question around injuries and the level that we would use. So turning to the injury first, we looked at the range of values that have been provided by GAD, and we took the decision thinking about the types of injury that might occur during a spaceflight incident, that actually we would apply the semi-serious category to the injury figure that we would look to apply in the modelling and the calculation of the insurance amount. And the reason for that is you may get a lot of lower level injuries, but then you may also get, unfortunately, some fatalities as well. And that therefore choosing the semi-serious was probably more reflective of a balance between those two sets. In terms of how we then took these figures forward generally in terms of a methodology, we looked at applying two different sets of criteria. So we looked at the probability of the level of financial loss that might arise against what we call the term consequence. So applying different values for death and injuries to determine what the impact would be in terms of government exposure, in terms of expected cost to government, and then also what would be the possible impact in terms of insurance requirements and therefore costs of insurance for operators. And so we plotted out against three different categories for each. And ultimately, what we did was we determined that we would set the insurance amount at a level of financial loss that might arise in 1 in 10 million launches. Because that would provide sufficient protection to the taxpayer and government. Any sort of different probability to that, so looking at 1 in 100 million, we didn't feel would offer substantially more protection for government. And in terms of the figures that we applied for deaths and injuries, we actually determined that it would be in terms of reducing operating costs, we would adopt the lower end of the scale of the value. So in terms of the figure that Nick provided, we're looking at the 200,000 figure rather than the 400,000 or a higher figure that we thought about in terms of in terms of the death figure, for example, because using those higher figures would effectively double the amount of insurance that operators would require, but not materially provide additional benefit in terms of limiting government exposure to potential losses. So we're setting insurance at a level that would be highly unlikely that would be breached, but if it was, that it would be still be reducing the operator costs as well. So hence we try to get that balance between those two sets.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, Steve. I think we just slide past a couple of questions to Richard. Richard, I think you've already answered one in the chat, but it might be worthwhile answering it for the generality. So that the question is, how does the climate piece of the data work align interact with the CGFI data project led by the Oxford Smith School, if at all, please? Maybe you could cover that one, Richard.
Yes, so that the funding for that came out a little bit before ours, so in terms of their work program was slightly ahead, although they started after us. So I think they were told that they had to talk to us about how, if they were going to be developing any kind of toolkit, that needed to integrate with what we are doing, because the idea is that what we're building for NERC should then connect to any new projects that NERC might fund that might involve some kind of online sort of digital tool set, and that should be integrated in with what we do. So although we're not starting until July, the idea is that we'll be working quite closely with them and speaking to them about how we can work together so as not to be kind of reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Richard. Richard, is there any other questions that you want to pick up on now? I know that Nick and Steve have got another couple they want to respond to, but if there's any you want to pick up, we can do that just now.
No, I was looking through that. I think that's it at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Nick, back to you and Steve in that case.
There's a very popular question, and I know Steve's had a lot of experience of answering it in terms of the potential environment impact of space travel and how that's been thought about. Steve, are you able to pick that up?
Yeah, I've just replied to a question on that, but it's absolutely a key consideration. So within the insurance calculation itself, we have included an element of cover for environmental purposes, part of the overall calculation. But just in terms of the environment generally, yes, environmental considerations will be one of the key areas of assessment. As part of a license application, there's something called the assessment of environmental effects, which we carried out as part of the license application. So it's a really key area to look at minimising the impacts on the environment generally. And I think it's fair to say that there is a lot of within the sector generally, there is a large focus in terms of minimising environmental impacts. So, for example, looking at new types of fuels, greener fuels, etc., as propellants and things like that. Looking at minimising debris impacts, etc., as well. So, it's one of the key assessment areas that we'll be looking at as part of the license application.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Steve. Nick, is there any other themes that you want to pick up on?
I'm just having a quick look through the Slido questions to see if there's anything. I think most there are some questions in terms of the location of launch and the fact that it's likely to be cheaper, or it might be cheaper to launch from other places. I think that's very much down to, I think a key point we need to make is that UK Space Agency are making it possible for people to launch from the UK, and people are expressing an interest. The decision in terms of the cost is actually the operators to decide. So operators are coming to UK Space Agency saying we want to launch from these sites in the UK, rather than UKSA actually saying that there will be a launch from there. So whilst there might be cheaper options elsewhere, operators are certainly showing that they want to use the UK. And the work that we are doing is saying, if there is to be a launch from the UK, this is how much the potential risk is. Do you want to add anything to that, Steve?
Yeah, just in terms of that, I think there isn't a set formula for how launch liability is calculated across the launching states. So the approach that we're adopting is very much along the lines of the approach that's adopted in the US, for instance. They have a methodology for calculating insurance requirements called the maximum probable loss, and essentially we are following the same model. But as Nick pointed out, we've tailored it to the specifics of the UK's compensatory regime, but also obviously to reflect the different circumstances, the property price and those sorts of things in terms of calculating the insurance. Now, other countries, for example, the launches that take place from the European spaceport, that will be a fixed limit of 60 million euros that's applied per launch. And so we looked at the type of launch that would be taking place from the UK, and felt that actually, having a fixed limit of that nature actually, wouldn't be appropriate for the diverse range of launch activities that we're looking to undertake. And potentially some forms of launch may in fact be potentially unviable when applying that sort of limit. So we are looking very much to tailor the launch insurance amount to the risks. Some other countries are also following suit now, about looking to adopt this sort of approach as well. So I think it's very much trying to reflect the risk, but also minimise the cost for the operators as well, to ensure that there isn't a level of over-insurance required for particular operations. But as Nick said, there's a whole regulatory cost associated with launch, and so yes, the insurance does play a key factor in terms of people's decisions to locate. So we think what we're doing here is offering a really attractive offer in terms of tailoring the insurance to the risks.
Okay.
If I can just pick up one more thing, Keith, because
okay.
I would hate to, of course,
give you 20 seconds. Nick.
I would hate to be causing an issue. No, Michael, I'm not suggesting that government decisions are taken before the risk assessment is done, and risk assessments would have taken place. And this links in with a question another question we had about wider environmental issues that don't have a fixed cost. These sort of things would have been factored in before decisions were made about where launches could take place. However, from the perspective of what we're doing, we are actually calculating how much could be awarded from a court case in terms of specific insurance liabilities. So those things were factored in, but were not part of our calculations because that wouldn't reflect the insurance cost. Sorry, Keith.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Yep, I certainly sense we could go on for quite a bit longer, but I think we're just about at time now. So Claire, if you just move on to the final 2 slides, please. We're just about to close off. So just a couple of final reflections from me. I'm sure we'd all agree that our world is far more unpredictable than it's ever been before. But certainly me, for sure, I've got no doubt whatsoever that quality analysis can help policy holders navigate this challenge. And we saw in the space industry case study that analytical expertise can enhance decisions even when the data is scarce. And we heard from Richard's case study that we can reduce uncertainty significantly by proving the availability and accessibility of quality data. And certainly by working together, policy makers and analysts can improve government decision making in uncertainty. Claire, if you just move on to the final slide now, please. So just another quick roundup and another quick plug from me. Please do get involved in the Analysis and Government Month. And for those of you who missed it at the beginning, you can go to gov.uk and search for Government Analysis Function, or YouTube/Government Analysis Function, or in Twitter, gov_analysis. And please also subscribe to the Analysis Function newsletter by emailing the team at analysis.function@ons.gov.uk. And finally, it just remains for me to thank you all for